I'd been staring at rental listings for so long that the blue light from my laptop had started to sting my eyes. Every ad seemed to blur into the next. Too expensive, too far, too suspiciously vague. My savings were thinning faster than I dared to admit, and the room I'd been crashing in at a friend's flat felt more borrowed by the day. Then I saw it. No photo of the landlord. Just a picture of a modest seaside townhouse with white shutters and ivy creeping up the wall. The kind of place that didn't look remarkable, but felt steady. I stared at the word affordable, as if it were a promise. After losing my job at the cafe and ending things with my boyfriend within the same miserable week, steady sounded almost divine, so I sent an email before I could talk myself out of it. Within the hour, a reply appeared. Short, punctuation perfect, no emojis. Something about the message, the restraint, the directness, felt oddly reassuring. The sun was slipping behind a row of terraced houses when I arrived. The street was quiet, save for the distant hum of the sea and the occasional bark of a dog. A thin fog had started to gather over the road, wrapping everything in that sleepy coastal calm Brighton always carried after sunset. The house looked exactly like the picture. Ivy-clad, pale shutters, the faint smell of salt in the air. I hesitated at the gate, clutching the strap of my rucksack as though it could convince me I belonged here. The door opened before I even knocked. He stood there, tall, maybe mid-30s, dark hair that fell slightly into his eyes, an expression caught somewhere between polite and unreadable. His stillness was the first thing I noticed. Like someone who had long ago made peace with silence. "You must be Owen," he said, voice even, low. "Yeah. Hi, about the room." He nodded once and stepped aside. "Come in." The hallway smelled faintly of cedar and something older, maybe old wood, maybe time. Everything was neat and deliberate, boots lined perfectly by the door. A dark coat hung on the single hook, walls a muted gray. No clutter, no mess. It was the kind of order that comes from living alone for too long. Nathan led me through to the living room. The furniture was practical. Sofa, bookshelves, a low coffee table stacked with novels, and the faintest film of dust. A few framed photos stood on the mantelpiece. A dog by a lake, a woman smiling without joy, a landscape blurred by sun glare. I noticed Nathan's eyes flick toward the woman's photo before turning away. "The room's upstairs," he said simply. We climbed the narrow staircase. The faint creak in the third step, the smell of polish, the hum of a fridge downstairs. The house had a heartbeat, quiet but steady. The spare room was small but bright. Painted cream, a single window overlooking the street, a twin bed, a desk, a dresser. The radiator gave a tired hiss, fighting off the evening chill. It wasn't much, but after weeks of limbo, it looked like sanctuary. "I can pay the first month in cash," I said quickly, afraid he might change his mind. "Just until I get things sorted again. I'm looking for work." Nathan studied me for a moment. Not suspiciously, just observing. "You're from around here?" "Originally from Bristol. Moved for university. Stayed for, well, everything else." He nodded as though that explained it all. "The rent includes utilities. Quiet hours after 10. No smoking, no parties." I almost laughed. "I think you'll find I'm exceptionally boring." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Brief, but real. "Good. It's a quiet house." We went back downstairs to sign a handwritten agreement. The paper smelled faintly of ink and something domestic, like old furniture polish. As I scribbled my name, I caught him watching me, not intently, just with a kind of patient stillness, like he was measuring what kind of person I might be. "That's my room," he said, gesturing to a closed door near the back hallway. "Bathroom's next to it. Kitchen's yours to use, just clean up after yourself." He didn't open the door. And something about that one sealed off. Space. Made me wonder what kind of things people keep behind closed doors, long after they've stopped needing them. "I'll take it," I said, surprising myself with how sure I sounded. He raised a brow. "You don't want to think about it?" I shook my head. "Feels right." "All right then." The deal was done. I moved in that same evening. My worldly possessions fit neatly into 3 boxes. Clothes, a few books, a chipped mug, a photo of Mum smiling with too much sunlight behind her. I unpacked slowly, grounding myself with each small placement. From downstairs came the faint shuffle of Nathan's footsteps, deliberate, unhurried. I could hear the quiet click of the kettle. By the time I ventured down for water, he was leaning against the counter, sleeves rolled up, waiting for the kettle to finish. "Settling in?" he asked. He glanced up from his mug. "You'll get used to it." Then, after a beat, sometimes quiet's the only thing that doesn't argue back. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just smiled faintly. He poured his tea, gave a short nod, and left me to the silence. Later, when I passed through the living room, I saw he'd left a folded blanket on the sofa, in case it gets cold upstairs. A note said in small, tidy handwriting. I didn't thank him, not because I wasn't grateful, but because it felt like the kind of gesture meant to exist quietly, without acknowledgement. That night, lying in my new bed, the world outside was hushed. The sea wind brushed against the window pane, rattling faintly. For the first time in weeks, I felt the ache of stillness press against me. Not unpleasantly, just unfamiliar. Then, through the floorboards, I heard it. The soft crackle of vinyl, then the low hum of a jazz record spinning, the kind of melody that belongs to another era, tender, worn, timeless. I pictured Nathan downstairs sitting in the dim light, maybe with a cup of tea in one hand, eyes half closed as the music filled the spaces where conversation didn't reach. There was something almost comforting about it. Two people in the same house, strangers sharing the same silence. As the song faded into soft static, I realized the ache I'd been feeling wasn't loneliness anymore. It was something gentler, something almost like peace. The quiet understanding that maybe this was where healing begins. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, listening to the distant sea through the open window. The air smelled faintly of salt and rain, the kind of scent that belongs to second chances. And for the first time in a long while, I slept without waiting for something to break. By the second week, I'd started to understand the house's rhythm, or maybe it was Nathan's. The man seemed to move by invisible clockwork. Every morning, just as the first pale light crept through the curtains, I'd hear him downstairs, the muffled clink of a mug and the slow whistle of the kettle. When I stumbled down half awake an hour later, there'd always be a cup already waiting beside the stove. Dark, strong coffee, no sugar, no milk. He never said it was for me, but it always was. No note, no words. Just the quiet certainty of the gesture. It became our unspoken routine. He'd leave before I'd properly woken, and when I came home later, the same mug would be washed and drying on the rack. Somehow, that small act became a kind of conversation, a language made of warmth and habit. A week later, I landed a part-time job at a second-hand bookshop near the pier. The pay was meager, but the hours were gentle. I liked the smell. Old paper, dust, and salt from the sea that crept in through the door whenever someone walked in. It was the kind of place that collected quiet souls, retirees, tourists hiding from the wind, students who pretended to read while watching the rain roll down the window. Nathan didn't say much when I told him about the job. Just a simple, "That's good," while rinsing his mug. But I could tell he meant it. Days passed in a calm repetition. Work, walk home, dinner, the sound of a record drifting faintly from downstairs. Sometimes I'd catch him reading in the living room when I came in, still in his work clothes, sleeves rolled to his elbows, head tilted slightly like he was trying to listen to something only silence could tell. We didn't eat together. Not at first. I'd cook something simple, pasta, soup, toast, and he'd quietly do the same at a different time. Two people existing side by side without stepping on each other's solitude. It should have felt lonely, but it didn't. It felt safe. By the end of November, the wind off the sea had turned sharp and cold. One night, it arrived all at once, the kind of storm Brighton knows too well. The air was electric, rain slamming against the windows in sheets, the sky flashing white every few minutes. I'd just set my dinner plate in the sink when the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then everything went black. I froze, disoriented. Somewhere downstairs, I heard movement. Deliberate, unhurried. A few seconds later, a warm amber glow appeared at the end of the corridor. "Power's gone," Nathan's voice said calmly. "It happens here more often than it should." He was holding a candle, the flame small but steady. The light softened his face, drawing gold along the lines of his jaw and catching in the faint tiredness under his eyes. He handed me one. Here, so we don't trip over each other. Thanks, I said quietly, the word catching in my throat. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by the hum of rain and thunder. Then, for the first time since I'd moved in, Nathan motioned to the dining table. Might as well wait it out. The candlelight made the room look different, gentler somehow. The walls that usually felt so neutral now glowed honey gold. The shadows danced slowly over the shelves and the corners, turning everything into something private and intimate. Nathan sat opposite me, one hand curled around his mug of tea, the other resting flat against the table as if grounding himself. I watched the candle flame flicker in his eyes. I used to like storms, I said softly. When I was a kid, my mum and I would sit by the window and count the seconds between lightning and thunder. He smiled faintly, just one corner of his mouth lifting. How many seconds meant you were safe? 5, I said. Anything less, and she'd drag me under a blanket like the world was about to end. She sounds like she cared. She did. I stared down at the wax pooling around the wick. She's been gone 3 years now. Sometimes I still find myself waiting for her to call. He nodded, gaze low. By mid-December, Brighton had turned bitter. The sea breeze that once felt cleansing now cut straight through my coat on the walk home. The streets glistened with thin ice, and every step carried the muffled crunch of winter. Inside the house, the cold crept in anyway. It settled in the walls, in the floorboards, even in the pauses of our conversations, if you could call them that. Nathan and I had fallen into a strange comfort. We weren't quite friends, but the silence between us had changed shape. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt like understanding. That night, though, even the radiator seemed to give up. I woke around midnight to the sound of it groaning, then rattling uselessly before falling still. The air in the room had that brittle cold that turns breath to mist. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but it was no use. My fingers ached, my nose burned. I tried waiting it out. Told myself it wasn't worth waking him, but after an hour of shivering under 2 blankets, I gave in. Nathan? I called down the hall, voice small in the dark. I heard a door open, soft footsteps on the landing. He appeared at the top of the stairs, hair messy, jumper thrown over what looked like sleep-warm skin. You all right? He asked, voice still rough with sleep. Sorry, I said quickly. My heater's gone. I think the pipe's frozen. He frowned, rubbing the back of his neck. Should have checked it earlier. That system's ancient. It's fine, I said, though my teeth chattered mid-sentence. I'll survive. He looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head, decisive. You won't. Not in that cold. I can layer up. Come downstairs, he interrupted, already turning toward his room. You can stay in mine tonight, my breath caught. What? Just for the night, he said, firm but kind. Until I fix the heater in the morning. The way he said just for the night was final. Not an invitation, but an instruction shaped by concern. Still, something in my chest fluttered with confusion. Not quite fear, not quite something else. Nathan's room was the only part of the house I hadn't seen. It was exactly what I'd imagined. Minimal dark wood furniture, a bookshelf lined with old poetry and history texts, a faint scent of cedar soap and tea leaves. One framed photo on the dresser sat face down. He gestured to the bed. It's a double. Plenty of space. I'll stay on my side. Are you sure? I asked quietly. He nodded. Positive. You'll freeze otherwise. I stood awkwardly for a moment before placing my pillow down, as if crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross. Okay, I murmured. Just for tonight. That earned the faintest smile from him. Crooked, tired, but gentle. Just for tonight. The first few minutes were agony. I lay stiff as a plank, afraid to move, afraid even to breathe too loudly. The duvet was heavy, the mattress dipped slightly under his weight, and the air between us pulsed with awareness. Nathan turned onto his back with a sigh. Are you warm enough? Yeah, I said, voice too quiet. Thank you. Try to sleep. As if it were that easy. My heartbeat was too loud in my ears, and every time he shifted, the fabric whispered in the dark. The warmth radiating from his side slowly began to seep across the mattress, chasing away the chill that had settled in my bones. It was strange. After weeks of coexisting through polite silence, here we were, breathing the same air, inches apart. I could smell the faint trace of coffee on his skin, the salt of winter air tangled in his hair. I closed my eyes, trying not to think about it. But the quiet made every small sound enormous. The tick of the clock, the wind pressing against the window, the soft exhale of his breath. Then his arm shifted, brushing lightly against mine. Just a touch, skin to skin for a second too long. We both froze. The air changed, thicker somehow, charged, but not threatening. I could feel his restraint, the careful stillness of a man who'd learned how to keep himself contained. Slowly he drew his arm back, not away in rejection, but in respect. Neither of us spoke. After a while, I found myself whispering into the dark. "Do you ever miss it?" His voice came back, low, half asleep. "Miss what?" "Having someone there, beside you." The silence stretched, so long that I thought he might not answer. Then quietly, every night, something inside me shifted. It wasn't desire that filled the air, not yet, but something deeper, recognition, too. People who understood what it meant to live in absence. I wanted to tell him I knew that feeling too. Of spaces that echo with memories, of beds that remember other bodies. But the words stayed caught somewhere between my heart and my throat. "Yeah," I whispered. "Me too." He exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding that breath for a long time. Outside, the wind scraped across the siding, a reminder of the cold world waiting beyond these walls. But inside, beneath the weight of silence, something fragile began to bloom. Not comfort, not yet, just the possibility of it. I must have drifted off sometime before dawn. When I opened my eyes, pale light was leaking through the curtains. Nathan was gone. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. The cold, the bed, the shared silence. But then I saw it. A folded note on the bedside table, written in his tidy hand. I stared at the note for a long time, a small smile tugging at my lips. Simple, direct, but underneath the practicality there was something else. Care disguised as routine. When I came downstairs, the house was filled with that familiar scent of strong coffee. Nathan was standing by the window, dressed for work, mug in hand. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual. He turned, nodding once. "Morning. The heater should work fine now." "Right. Thanks for fixing it." No trouble, and that was it. No mention of the night before, no glance that lingered too long. Just two people standing in a kitchen, pretending the world hadn't tilted ever so slightly. But as he left for work, I caught the faintest look. Not quite a smile, not quite nothing. Something had changed. That night, when the jazz began again downstairs, the melody sounded different. It wasn't lonely anymore. It sounded like a heartbeat. The weeks that followed the heater night were quiet, almost normal. But not quite. There was a new current in the air. Something I couldn't name, but could feel in every pause. Every glance that lasted a moment too long. Nathan and I didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't need to. The silence between us had become something alive, humming softly beneath the routine of our days. Mornings followed their usual pattern. He made coffee before work. I pretended not to notice the extra mug waiting beside the kettle. He'd mutter something about the weather or the boiler, and I'd answer with a half smile. On the surface, everything looked the same. But beneath it, beneath the careful restraint, something warm was quietly growing. I started helping around the house without being asked. Fixing the loose hinge on the cupboard, tightening the window latch that rattled in the wind. I cooked sometimes too, leaving leftovers in the fridge with a sticky note that simply read, "Help yourself." He never replied, but the empty plate the next morning was answer enough. The house began to feel less like a stranger's home, and more like a shared space, a rhythm built between us. Gentle, hesitant, but undeniably there. One Wednesday evening, everything unraveled. I'd come home from the bookshop drenched in rain, my umbrella turned inside out by the sea wind. There was another rejection email waiting in my inbox. One of those sterile ones that begins with, "We appreciate your interest." The kind that stings not because it matters, but because it keeps happening. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the laptop screen until the words blurred into meaningless shapes. Then, without warning, the lump in my throat broke. It wasn't dramatic, no sobbing, no theatrics, just a quiet, exhausted kind of crying. The kind that comes when you've been holding everything too tightly for too long. I didn't hear Nathan come in. His footsteps were always soft, and I was too lost in trying to swallow the noise of my own breathing. "Owen?" His voice was gentle, but it startled me. I wiped at my face too quickly, pretending it was nothing. "Hey, sorry, just one of those days." He set his keys down and walked closer, his expression unreadable. "Bad news?" Another rejection. I tried to laugh it off. Feels like I've run out of versions of myself to sell. He didn't laugh. Instead, he sat down beside me. For a few seconds, he said nothing at all. Then, carefully, he reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. Just that. A hand. Steady, firm, grounding. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't pity. It was presence. And somehow, that made it harder to breathe. I kept my eyes on the table, blinking fast. But the tears came anyway. Silent and hot. He didn't move his hand away. His thumb pressed once, gently, like a reminder that I wasn't invisible. "You're trying too hard to hold it all together," he said softly. "I have to," I whispered. "If I stop, I don't know what's left." He gave a small nod, eyes still on me. "You'd still be you." That's usually enough. The kindness in his tone undid me more than anything else. I laughed weakly, half a sob. "You really think so?" He smiled faintly. "Yeah, you're a good person, Owen." The way he said my name, low, deliberate, made something tighten in my chest. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't good, not really. That I'd been thinking about him too much. About that night in his bed. About the warmth that had stayed long after I'd left it. But the words stayed trapped behind my teeth. Nathan's hand lingered for a second longer before he stood. His voice quieter now. "Eat something, then get some sleep. The world looks less cruel in the morning." He left before I could answer. The sound of his door closing echoed softly through the hall. And I sat there, staring at the empty space where his hand had been. It was strange. How a single moment of comfort could feel more intimate than anything I'd ever known. The days that followed were heavier. Somehow. Not in a bad way. Just full of things unspoken. He started leaving little traces again. A slice of toast buttered. A note on the counter saying, "Out early, back by 6." I began to cook more often, pretending it was just convenience, though both of us knew better. One night, I passed his room and saw a sliver of lamplight spilling into the corridor. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, reading something, brow furrowed. The sight made something ache inside me. Not desire exactly, but care, deep and quiet. That same night, sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about the way his hand had felt on my shoulder, how steady it was. Eventually, I gave up pretending to rest and went downstairs for water. The living room was dimly lit, just one lamp casting soft gold across the floor. Nathan sat on the sofa, a mug of tea cradled in his hands. He looked up when I entered but didn't seem surprised. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. I shook my head. "You either?" He gave a half shrug. "Old habit. Nights have a way of remembering what the days forget." I sat down at the far end of the sofa, leaving a safe space between us. The clock ticked quietly. Rain whispered against the window. "What are you remembering tonight?" I asked softly. He exhaled, staring into his mug. "Too much. Too little. Depends how honest I feel." I waited. I'd learned by now that silence worked better than questions. Finally, he said, "When my wife left, I thought I'd built my life to be steady. But steadiness isn't the same as being alive. After she left, I filled the house with quiet. Thought if I stayed still enough, nothing else could break." I traced a pattern on the sofa's fabric with my thumb. "Did it work?" He looked at me, eyes tired but open. "Not really. It just made the emptiness easier to schedule." That made both of us laugh. The small, sad kind of laugh that feels like relief. "I know that feeling," I said. "You start measuring life in small things. Meals, chores, hours. Like if you keep moving, you won't notice what's missing." Nathan nodded slowly, setting his mug down. "You get it more than most people your age should. Guess I'm an overachiever in all the wrong subjects." The corner of his mouth lifted again, but this time, the smile stayed a little longer. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was soft. Something in it had shifted. Like we'd both stopped pretending that what existed between us was ordinary. "You've made this place feel different, you know," he said after a while. "Quieter but not lonely." I swallowed. "Different good or different inconvenient?" He met my eyes. "Different needed." The words settled between us, fragile as glass. My chest tightened. I didn't trust myself to speak. Nathan's gaze didn't waver. His next words came out lower, rougher. "It's been years since I let anyone close. But you—" He hesitated. "You feel like something I forgot I needed." I didn't think. I just looked back at him, heart thudding, everything else falling away. He reached out then, slow enough for me to move if I wanted. I didn't. His hand brushed my cheek, fingers trembling slightly, thumb tracing the edge of my jaw. It wasn't a question. It was permission. I leaned into the touch. He breathed in, shaky. "I don't want to ruin anything," I whispered. "You won't," he said. His voice almost broke on the words. There's nothing left to ruin, just things worth rebuilding. And then he kissed me softly, carefully, like someone remembering how. It wasn't hunger that drove it. It was relief, recognition. Two people who'd spent too long in silence finally letting it speak for them. His hand slid to the back of my neck. Mine rested against his chest, where his heart beat steady and unsure. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads stayed pressed together, breaths uneven. I didn't mean for this to happen, he murmured. Neither did I said. But I'm not sorry, he smiled, the smallest, realest smile I'd seen on him yet. Me neither. We didn't talk after that. We didn't need to. He reached for the blanket draped over the sofa and pulled it around us, a quiet instinct. I leaned against him, feeling his arm come to rest around my shoulders. Outside, the rain still fell, soft and steady. Inside, the warmth between us filled every corner of the silence. For the first time in a long while, the world didn't feel like something we had to survive. It felt like something we could share. By the time spring crept into Brighton, the cold had loosened its grip, and the house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. The air smelled faintly of salt and soil. Light spilled through the windows for longer each day, softening the corners of rooms that had once been gray with winter. Life between us had settled into something gentle, something real. There was no big moment of confession after that night on the sofa. No what are we now talk, no dramatic pause before a decision. Things simply unfolded. Quietly. Naturally. Nathan still woke first every morning, making coffee so strong it could probably wake the dead. I'd stumble downstairs half asleep, hair sticking out, and he'd slide a mug across the counter without saying a word. My plain blue mug had joined his chipped one, the one that said World's okayest cook, and they lived side by the sink like they'd always belonged there. The spare room, the one I'd first rented, slowly turned into a study. My books migrated to the living room shelves, squeezed in between his poetry and history titles. My jacket hung permanently on the back of the chair he'd once asked me not to use. I hadn't paid rent in months, and he hadn't asked. Somewhere along the way, the house stopped being his and started being ours. We built our days around small rituals. On weekends, we'd go to the market early, him inspecting vegetables like they were old friends, me pretending I knew what to look for. We'd return home with bags of herbs, bread, and too many tins of tea neither of us would ever finish. Sometimes we worked in the small patch of garden out back. Nathan said tending something that grows teaches patience. I wasn't sure I believed him at first, but there was something oddly peaceful about kneeling in the dirt beside him, our hands brushing as we pulled stubborn weeds. Maybe they're just trying to stay, I said once, flicking one from the soil. He smiled. Maybe they just don't know where else to belong. His words stayed with me for days. Maybe because they sounded like something neither of us had admitted aloud. Neighbors noticed the changes before we did. They'd wave when they saw us carrying groceries together or sitting on the porch with mugs of tea. Some probably assumed we were just flatmates. Maybe they whispered, maybe they didn't. We never corrected anyone. What we had didn't need explaining. It didn't need a label to make it real. At night, the same record player still sat in the corner of the living room. Sometimes Nathan would put on one of those old jazz albums, the ones he used to play alone. I'd tease him, call it melancholy for middle-aged men, and he'd roll his eyes. But when the music played, he'd pull me close, and we'd move together slowly, barefoot on the old wooden floor. We weren't dancers. We didn't need to be. It wasn't about steps. It was about stillness. About being seen. There were arguments, of course. We weren't perfect. Once, we fought over something ridiculous. Whether to replace the old sofa or not. I stormed off to what used to be my room, slamming the door for good measure. Hours later, I found a cup of tea outside the door, still warm, and a note in his handwriting. This house is big enough for both our tempers. Don't freeze yourself out again. By morning, we were laughing about it. That was how it went. Nothing lasted long enough to break us. It only reminded us how much we wanted to stay. Summer came, and the house bloomed with the season. The windows stayed open most days, the curtains dancing in the sea breeze. We started taking short drives, to the coast, to antique shops, to nowhere in particular. The world outside felt less intimidating when he was beside me. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me, quietly, like he was still trying to believe I was real. Once I caught his gaze and asked, "What?" He smiled, soft and almost shy. "Still getting used to this." "This?" I asked, teasing. "This," he said simply, reaching for my hand. "Not wanting to wake up alone." I squeezed his fingers gently. Then don't. He didn't. Time didn't erase the loneliness we'd both carried. It just made it quieter, smaller, easier to live with. There were nights when Nathan would wake suddenly, breath uneven, haunted by dreams he never described. I'd reach out, resting a hand on his back until his breathing steadied again. He never said thank you. He didn't have to. We didn't fix each other. That was never the point. We just stopped pretending we didn't need to be found. One morning in early summer, sunlight spilled through the curtains, warm and golden. I woke first for once, which felt like a small miracle. Nathan was still half asleep beside me, one arm flung across the sheets, hair messy in a way that made me smile. "You snore," I whispered. One eye opened. "I do not." "You do," I said, grinning. Quietly. Like a bear that's embarrassed to be a bear. He chuckled, voice low and rough with sleep. "You're impossible." "And yet," I said, leaning closer, "here I am." He shifted to face me, fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. "You know," he murmured, "you never did pay rent again." I raised an eyebrow. "Really? You're bringing that up now?" He smiled. "Just an observation." "Fine," I said, pretending to think. "I'm paying in something better." "Oh? What currency is that?" "Coffee, bad jokes, and staying." His hand reached for my face, thumb brushing my cheek with that same quiet tenderness that had started everything months ago. "That's more than enough," he said softly. After breakfast, we walked to the seaside. It was something we did often now, a habit that felt like coming full circle. The same stretch of coast where I'd first arrived, scared and uncertain, now felt like home. The air was gentle, the sea calm. We sat on the pebbles, the world humming quietly around us. "Do you ever think about before?" I asked. He glanced at me. "Before what?" "Before me. Before all this." He took a slow breath, watching the waves. "Sometimes I miss the quiet I used to mistake for peace," he said, "but not enough to want it back." I smiled, letting my shoulder rest against his. Good. We sat like that for a long while, listening to the sound of the sea rolling in and out. Steady, rhythmic, alive. As the sky turned gold and the wind softened, I thought about the first night I'd seen this house online. The tiny, lifeless ad that had led me here. Back then, all I'd wanted was shelter. Somewhere to keep the rain out. Somewhere to be small and safe until life stopped feeling so heavy. But shelter had turned into something else. Now, sitting beside Nathan, our hands brushing idly over the pebbles, I realized what I'd really found wasn't a roof over my head. It was warmth. It was the quiet that no longer scared me. It was home. That evening, back in the house, the record player hummed softly in the corner. The same jazz melody from the night I'd moved in. Still cracked and scratchy, still beautiful. Nathan poured 2 cups of tea and joined me on the sofa. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Outside, the sea wind whispered through the open window, and the faint smell of salt and cedarwood filled the room. I leaned my head against his shoulder, and his arm came around me automatically, as if the gesture had been there waiting all along. For a long time, we just breathed together, our silence no longer a barrier, but a promise. And in that stillness, I finally understood. Love doesn't always arrive with sparks or declarations. Sometimes, it's just 2 silences learning how to share the same room. If you enjoyed, he offered me his spare room, but I ended up in his heart. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another heartfelt story. Now tell me in the comments below, do you think love grows quietly, through small moments and unspoken care? Or does it always need that first spark to begin? Your thoughts and stories always inspire the next one.